named Wilmedow. MacArthur's plan, codenamed Operation Chromite, was to assemble a vast naval force carrying 70,000 US troops who would brave the dangerous tides of Incheon Harbor and land on the beaches. The Marines would first have to take the key beach at Wilmedow, codenamed Green Beach, which was only possible during the short window when the tide was high. Once the enemy had been silenced on Wilmedow, the rest of the landing force would have to wait a whole 12 hours for the tide to rise again before they could assault Red Beach to the north of Incheon and Blue Beach to the south. Set for mid-September 1950, Operation Chromite was to be the largest amphibious landing since D-Day. Many of MacArthur's colleagues thought his plan near impossible. One of them even said, "We drew up a list of every natural and geographic handicap, and Incheon had them all." MacArthur himself privately admitted his Operation Chromite was risky. It was going to be a tough assignment for the crack US Marines, hand-picked to carry out the operation.
All positions APS unknown, bears 193, speed fast.
The Marines' success hung on meticulous planning. But when I went to visit the British Royal Marines aboard HMS Albion, I found out just how many factors can throw the best plan off course.
There's the weather, there's the tide that has an impact, the sea state.
Of course, the Americans at Incheon had real problems with the tides, very high tides, just a 12-hour gap between them. How important is it to get the tides absolutely right?
Well, if we get it wrong, then we're going to end up either getting caught on sandbars offshore.
And you're at the mercy of enemy fire.
Absolutely. And if the tide is too high, then of course you may be actually slamming into the sea wall, equally difficult to get people off. So timing is absolutely crucial.
Now, when your landing craft are underway, and you're on that landing craft with all your guys, how critical to you is the covering fire that's coming down on the enemy as you go into the beach?
Absolutely fundamental. And that's why all our destroyers and our frigates have big guns on the front. That's what they're for, is to buy us that time to get ashore. But this will be a matter of supreme concern for the lads that are now on the landing craft and steaming into the beach.
Not directly involved. I shall make clear if you sort of reach some
And what's it like being on a landing craft on your way into a beach?
There will be guys that are utterly disorientated. They won't have a clue if they're in exactly the right position, what they're going to see when they get off the landing craft. Given with that, some will have been sick, some will be dizzy, some will be confused.
And frightened?
Oh, hugely frightened. One of the crew of the landing craft, who's working up on deck, will be shouting 500 metres to go, 400 metres to go, and then counting them down. And of course they get to 100 metres to go, they all stand up, the doors get pushed open, and then they're just stood there waiting for the ramp to drop. Hit the beach, ramp goes down, and then they're off.
The US Marines waiting off the coast of Incheon were about to go through exactly the same experience as 0 hour for the amphibious landing drew near. At around 6 a.m. on the 15th of September, the actual landing part of the operation swung into action, under the cover of Allied naval gunfire. 6 British and American destroyers had already steamed in to within a mile of the city, and anchored so that their guns could fire at point-blank range on Wilmedow and the entire Incheon area. For 2 days, Incheon had been bombed by aircraft dropping napalm on the North Korean defenses and pounded by warships. Now, under yet more covering fire, the landing craft used the high tide to sweep in from the sea and land on Wilmedow's Green Beach. Through the chaos caused by the supporting fire, wave after wave of landing craft headed for Green Beach.
Smoke was boiling out of Incheon. The entire beach area simply disappeared in an enormous cloud of dust and smoke, with only the occasional glare of rocket burst showing through. It was just awesome.
But as the first wave of Marines approached Green Beach, they were faced with a daunting task. Scaling the 12-foot-high defensive seawalls under enemy fire.
Well, this is Green Beach on Walmedo today. Not quite the same sight that would have greeted the first wave of US Marines as they clambered up the sea wall. With the second wave of Marines just 4 minutes behind, they quickly advanced inland, the landscape blackened and blasted by the covering fire. The Marines swept over the island, meeting limited resistance and suffering few casualties. In just 2 hours, the Marines' commander radioed the waiting fleet. Walmedo secured. Phase 1 of their mission had been accomplished. Marines, the battle had only just begun. As this tide retreated, it took with it the landing craft, their vital lifeline to the Allied ships out there. They had to dig in. For the next 12 hours, they had the unenviable task of defending the island against a possible counterattack. It was vital the Marines held their ground. Only if they retained control of this crucial island could further waves of landing craft move safely onto Incheon itself. They waited hour after hour for the tide to turn, waiting to defend against any North Korean counterattack. But the big attack never came. Only at 5:30 did the tide come back in, and conditions were again favourable for the next phase of the American landings further up the channel. Red Beach fell to the Marines with little resistance. But there was still one more beach to capture. Almost simultaneously, the Marines assaulted here at Blue Beach, about a mile south of Incheon. But things on Blue Beach didn't go quite as smoothly. Out to sea, 25 separate assault waves had formed, but as they approached the shore, many of them were swept wildly off course by the strong currents. The assault on Blue Beach was in disarray. Landing craft at risk of capsizing, men in danger of drowning. Those who did make it through found the beach choked with smoke from the earlier naval bombardment.
The actual landing conditions were terrible. The city was on fire, and the rain was mixing with the smoke and fire of the bombardment, so it was very difficult finding the beach. Some units got mixed up, landing on the wrong beaches, and we just had to get it all sorted out.
Despite the problems, there was no serious opposition to stop the Allied advance. They managed to push on through Incheon and further inland. Their journey took them eastwards, liberating village after village, rapidly crushing what little North Korean resistance they met. Their bold attack behind enemy lines had been a resounding success. In just 11 days, the men of the United Nations Army had reached their target and recaptured the South Korean capital, Seoul. The war in Korea was taking a whole new turn.
By now, the Allied forces pinned down inside the Pusan perimeter had been reinforced with fresh battle-ready troops. They broke out and thrust north to join those who'd recaptured Seoul. The United Nations forces could now attack the North Korean troops from two directions. Kim Il-sung's army was effectively surrounded and quickly collapsed. Within just 2 weeks, the Allies had pushed the crumbling North Korean army back over the 38th parallel, back into North Korea. It was an incredible turnaround. The two Koreas were now back where they began, divided by the 38th parallel. The question for the UN allies was what to do next. The United Nations could have ended the war right there, but MacArthur wanted to press on. He didn't just want to kick communism out of South Korea, but crush it in North Korea as well. He said the North should pay the penalty for invading the South. He urged the United Nations to take the war across the border. At the end of September 1950, MacArthur got his way. He was given the go-ahead to cross the 38th parallel and push into North Korea. The UN army were no longer repelling an invasion. They had themselves become the invaders. The Allied invasion of North Korea began very well. On October the 7th, the main body of the United Nations force drove northwards, and within a month they'd overrun the communist capital, Pyongyang. Still they pressed on, scattering any North Koreans who opposed them. The United Nations forces were now within reach of fulfilling MacArthur's vision of a total victory over communism and a united anti-communist Korea. Word went around that MacArthur had even promised his troops would be home by Christmas, in a month's time. But every step his men took north threatened to awaken a sleeping dragon. MacArthur's troops were now fast approaching the Yalu River, the border between North Korea and Communist China. The Chinese leader, Mao Zedong, had been watching events in Korea. His new communist regime was only a year old and far from secure. Now the United Nations Army was rapidly approaching his eastern border. As far as Mao was concerned, this was blatant imperialist aggression, and it had to be stopped. In September 1950, he ordered the Chinese People's Volunteer Army into North Korea. Led by Commander Peng De-Hua,